Friday morning. Looking forward to some snow this weekend finally. So we'll see. Of course, school will be canceled, right? Because nobody can get to school. So thank you, Jan, for asking me to do this talk. This is a talk that I've been meaning to write for a number of years now. Just like I was meaning to write my latest book, What's the Big Deal About Addictions? Helping Answers for Teenagers. Um, One of my colleagues, Vicky Castro, social worker, invited me to do a talk a couple of years ago, and we were talking about, are you writing any more books? And I said, well, I'm thinking about writing this book about addiction for teenagers. And she says, yeah, that's a really big need. You really should go ahead and do that. And I started thinking about it. And one of the good things about the pandemic is when things were quieter, I was able to put a lot of time into finishing the book and the edits. And the book actually comes out in the next couple of weeks, so it'll be available. And actually, you guys will have a discount code at the end of the talk that will allow you to order any of my books through Free Spirit Publishing. I think it's a 20% discount, something to that effect. So, all right, let's move on. So I'm gonna cover a lot of ground today, so we will get to most of it. We'll take breaks here periodically for questions. Jan will be monitoring that, so feel free to, if you have a question that pops up, she'll interrupt me as needed as well. So I think since the pandemic in particular, you've probably been hearing about this, rates of addiction among all age groups have increased. Stress of online school, not being able to see your friends, make it harder for many kids and parents to cope. And addictions actually can take the form of substances as well as behaviors, and I'll talk about that a little bit as well. You've probably heard about video game addiction, and it is a real thing. There's some controversy about that, but again, I'll get to that in a little bit. So, so during the talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about why people use drugs and alcohol, use versus abuse, what is addiction. I'll throw a few statistics at you about the scope of the problem. I'll talk about a few more details about alcohol and drug use, some things to be aware of, especially if you're helping teenagers. It's important to know a little bit more about these. We'll talk about behavioral or tech addictions, some of the risk factors, such as family history, et cetera. What we do to diagnose addictions. I'll briefly review treatment options. And what I'm going to focus more on, a little bit more time on this, is helping teens avoid relapse. So if you're working with a teenager or you're raising a teenager who is struggling with this, there's a number of things that you can do that will help. Parental involvement is really important, both if just on a family level, but also in terms of therapy. It's really important because if parents are not involved in therapy, especially for addictions, it's not going to work nearly as well. And then parental self-care. This is very, very stressful for everybody. So it's really important to make sure you take some time to take care of yourself. You don't want to have everything revolve around somebody's addictive disorder, though that is a very common thing just because it is so overwhelming. Okay. And then I have some resources at the end of the talk as well. So what I'd like to do is just read a few examples from my book on teenagers that I've worked with. It's a sort of a combination of different cases. But just think about whether or not this sounds like use, abuse, or addiction. Anthony looks forward to hanging out with his lacrosse team buddies after games. Sometimes his teammates bring a six-pack of beer or even some liquor to celebrate their wins. While laughing and joking with his friends seems harmless, you can't help but think about the coach told the team at the beginning of the season they can get kicked off the team permanently if they get caught drinking or using drugs. Tamika enjoys checking out her friends' posts on social media. Instagram and Snapchat are her go-tos to keep her connections with friends. But lately, she's been finding herself spending more and more time checking her phone to see who's posted and how many people have liked her pictures and posts. And if she doesn't get enough likes, she feels like something's bad going on, or maybe she did something wrong, or she's losing some of her friends that they're less interested in her. She's afraid of missing out on anything and checks her phone in the middle of the night when her parents are not aware of this. Adrian spends a lot of time gaming. Most of his weekends are spent in front of a screen. His parents are complaining about how much time he spends gaming. But he figures, well, it's okay because that's where my friends are. So I don't see what the problem is. Give you one more example. Jamal enjoys smoking weed with his friends. He does it mostly on the weekends. Since he doesn't do it every weekend, he figures, how much of a problem can it be? But lately, he's starting to use more during the week and finds that he needs it to help him sleep. And if he doesn't use it, he's up pretty late. So these just casual users? Are they addicted? How do you tell the difference? There was a book when I was first starting in the field back in the 80s, Craving for Ecstasy. And I think it really captures what's behind addictive behaviors. That all of us are sort of craving for some better feelings, to have joy in our life. And we want it, of course, we want it without any side effects. That's the key, because it's not quite how it works. I don't know if anybody remembers, speaking of the 1980s, Huey Lewis and the News. I'm just gonna play part of one of their signature songs and just listen. There we go. So, no problem, right? Who wouldn't want all those things? The problem with this, of course, is your brain. Your brain gets used to any new substance that you put into it. So, through the mechanism of tolerance. So, one of the problems is that since your brain is designed to keep a homeostasis, you put a drug in there which supercharges the brain. Eventually, your brain gets used to it and reduces the response level. So then you need more to achieve the same effect. And when you have that more, that's when some of the side effects and negative consequences will occur. So, who can relate to this picture here? Multitasking, right? And some parents really get upset about this because they think, well, how can he really be focusing on his schoolwork because he's lying down on the couch and he's got all this other stuff going on? For some teenagers, that does work pretty well. If you're really bored with your schoolwork and you're doing a bunch of stuff, as long as it eventually gets done, I don't worry too much about this. But certainly there are other people who cannot do this. And if they are distracted, there's no way they're going to be able to focus on the task at hand. And so, again, it's a balancing act that can be a little bit tricky. So let's talk a little bit about why people use drugs or alcohol. I mean, obviously, it's got to lead to some positive feelings, otherwise you wouldn't do it. So I think most of you could relate to these things. You know, you relax, you forget about your problems, can sleep better, feel less depressed, less angry, boost creativity, acceptance, relieve boredom. Certainly, boredom is a big issue these days in terms of you just can't go too many places. I want to focus for a second there on self-medicating. Self-medicating is when people use alcohol or drugs to treat a psychological problem. That would go to the reducing anxiety, feeling less depressed, feeling less angry. So once you get into self-medicating for a disorder, a couple things happen. It may work well at the outset, but as time goes on, usually it causes more problems. And so if you don't treat those underlying disorders, it's much harder for people to try to beat an addiction. And that's a tough one as well. Just to give you an example of gaming, I've worked with a number of teenage boys and they're depressed and they're gaming, but gaming is the only way that they feel good or feel happy. When they're not doing it, they're feeling awful. And so it's really hard. Where do you draw the line? You don't want to take that away from them completely because it's the only thing that's making them happy. But at the same time, if you let it go on and on, they don't sleep, they're up all night, they sleep during the day, and obviously that doesn't work well. All right. And one thing I want to say about that as well, that for many teens, occasional use of a substance may never cause a problem. That doesn't mean that you're condoning it. That doesn't mean that it's a good or a wise choice, given that obviously drugs are illegal, alcohol is illegal for teenagers. Vaping even is now being more restricted because there's so many teenagers that were vaping. There's still a lot, but when you put these fancy flavors in there, it's very clear who these companies are marketing to. So I think that's the message I also give to teenagers. This is not a wise choice. If you're going to make this choice, here's some things to make it less risky or less dangerous. And we'll talk more about that again as we go along. All right, what is the definition of addiction? addiction is a compulsive need for a habit-forming substance or activity. Okay? This need can be physical, psychological, or both. So it can be a physical need such as pain, for example, psychological needs such as boredom, anxiety, depression, or both. Now, most users of tech and most users of drugs or alcohol don't become addicted. The problem with this, though, especially for teenagers, is the younger they are when they start using, the greater the chances are that they will become addicted. So one bit of advice to give teenagers is, if you can hold off experimenting with these things longer so your brain finishes developing, you're less likely to be addicted. All right, let's go back here a second. Many drugs boost levels of dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain, and it is one of the transmitters involved in feeling pleasure having completed activities. For example, if you are doing something that is really enjoyable, your brain boosts the level of dopamine. That's what makes it enjoyable. When you put kids on medication for ADHD, for example, you increase the levels of dopamine. So it makes it more rewarding to do things like your homework. And the drugs tap into the brain's communication system and tamper with how it processes information. So this is also important. Again, as I said earlier, once you start messing with that, your brain has ways of trying to normalize it, hence needing more and more of a substance or a behavior to feel good. All right. So let me look at a little bit about the scope of the problem here. So you see here, 60% have had at least one drink, 30% in the last 30 days. So that's 1/3. So that is quite a bit. 42% have tried vaping, 13% in the last 30 days. You got 35% using marijuana. So that's a fair amount. Now, a lot of times kids will tell you, okay, everybody does it. That's not true. Not everybody does it. But if you're hanging around people who use, then probably every one of your friends is using it as well. So, all right. Let's talk a little bit about alcohol use. So alcohol is a depressant drug, but it also relaxes the control centers of the brain. So how that's related is at lower levels, alcohol may make you feel better because it makes you less inhibited. So you feel a little bit giddy, whatnot, a little bit of a buzz. At higher levels, it's much more of a depressant. At extremely high levels, it certainly can kill you from alcohol poisoning. And one of the problems with teenagers, they do tend to do things to excess. You know, drinking games, for example, where there's a competition between kids as to who can drink the most. The problem with that, of course, is that it raises your level so high that, again, you can poison yourself and your brain, your lungs just stop breathing because, and that's how alcohol poisoning can work. So it's a very serious thing. So this is one of the things to keep in mind as well. Let me just kind of throw that out there is, if you know your teenager is drinking away at college when people were going to college in person, very often they get involved with parties and whatnot, excessive drinking. You've probably heard that there have been some cases where students have died because they thought they would just let somebody sleep it off. So it's one of the things I mentioned in my book is that don't leave somebody alone if they've been drinking. If there's any concern, you need to call 911 right away. And that's hard if you think you're going to get in trouble, but it's really important for them to know you could save somebody's life. And some of these kids have gone to jail for their delinquency in terms of how they handle some of these frat parties, for example. In terms of blood alcohol level, that's how much alcohol is in your blood. One of the things to keep in mind is your body can metabolize about a drink an hour. So if you drink more than that, it builds up in your blood. And so that's what raises your blood alcohol level because your liver can only metabolize about 1 drink an hour. So when it raises, that's when you run into trouble. And 0.08 blood alcohol content or concentration is the legal limit, but a couple things to keep in mind. 0.05 is enough to slow your reaction times. It doesn't take that much. And the bar is even lower for teenagers because we know that even a little bit of alcohol for teenagers can affect their responsiveness because they're younger drinkers. They don't have as much experience with that. One of the things that they don't realize, and this is something, again, these are some things that you can tell teenagers to help them think about their choices. If you get into an accident and you are breathalyzed and you test as having any amount of alcohol in your system, and if they believe that that alcohol led to the accident, you don't have to have a 0.08 level. You can be charged with a driving while under the influence if you had a much lower level, but they believe that it contributed to the accident. Now, there are some apps here. These are just a couple of examples. These apps will help kids figure out how much alcohol they're drinking and estimate their blood alcohol levels. So again, it may seem like this is condoning their use, but if you use it responsibly, you can actually monitor that and say, okay, my level is probably here. I need to wait a while longer before I drive or go home, whatever. Drug abuse. Yeah, a lot of stuff going on here. There's so many different drugs that are available. One thing to keep in mind in terms of drug abuse is a lot of this depends on the supply and how available they are. One of the unfortunate things about crackdowns on prescribing of opiates, for example, when you crack down on opiate because people are getting addicted to opiates and painkillers and what's happening with OxyContin, if it's harder for you to get the medication, then people are more likely to go to illegal sources. So you have, mothers in their 30s and 40s buying heroin on the streets because they can't get OxyContin that helps them with a severe injury that causes chronic pain. So that's an unintended effect. Same with restrictions on drinking. If you restrict drinking on campus, sometimes what happens is people go to other things. And most people know how to access marijuana. And vaping, of course, vaping in the school bathrooms, where a lot of teenagers are getting in trouble for that. All right. So let me talk a little bit more about drug use here. National Institute on Drug Abuse, it's listed as a resource, I believe, at the end of the talk here. Gives a lot of really useful information on drugs if you're wanting to learn more. But basically, there are 4 categories of drugs. You got depressants, which basically slow your brain down, which has a calming effect. Alcohol is one. Valium, Klonopin, Xanax, Ativan, those are all depressants. And they're very good for lowering anxiety. The problem with the depressants is they work very quickly. And so when they work very quickly and you immediately can cut your anxiety by taking Xanax, then number one, you're not as likely to learn healthier coping strategies to deal with anxiety. And 2, it makes it more addictive. Narcotics, opioids, heroin, morphine, Vicodin, and of course, OxyContin. Narcotics are designed to reduce pain and suppress coughing. They're very good at both of those things. Unfortunately, at higher doses, people get high off of them. And it provides what people will say when they're abusing opiates is that it provides a sense of contentment that they can't seem to get from other areas in their life. And these are dangerous as well, because again, narcotics can shut off your breathing as well and kill you. That's overdosing. And one of the things that it's really important to keep in mind here, you guys have probably heard of fentanyl. So one of the things about fentanyl, which is a synthetic or manufactured opioid, it's about 50 times stronger than heroin. So what people, and it's cheaper. So what people will do is put a little bit of fentanyl in a bag of heroin. That way they make more money off of it, right? The problem, of course, is that you don't really know how strong it is. And that's why you hear cases of people overdosing, on one time, maybe they didn't use for a long time and all of a sudden they do it. They may have taken in a much higher amount than they realize. Stimulants, cocaine, ecstasy, crystal meth, including legal stimulants such as Ritalin, Adderall, Vyvanse, Focalin. They are legal to be used for treating things like ADHD, also sleep disorders. Stimulants are good for keeping you awake. They make you more focused. On college campuses, you've all heard about people abusing Adderall and sharing it with their friends. That way you can have fun, stay up really late if you have to study for a test, and you actually do better. So some people will actually try to get these stimulants because they think it's going to make them more successful at school. The problem, of course, is that you have a crash afterward, and stimulants also can stimulate your heart. So one of the things we know is that if you're on a stimulant medicine and you drink heavily, that combination can be deadly. It's one of the reasons that we often recommend for teenagers, if you're on medication for ADHD and you're going to drink, it's probably best not to take your medication that day because it can be risky. Hallucinogen persisting perceptual disorder. I want to just mention this really briefly, is that there's some people who are using hallucinogenics, LSD, PCP, things like that, magic mushrooms, etc. But what happens is after they use, and they may not use for that many times, that what happens is they have these flashbacks, they have these perceptual problems. They call it visual snow. So you see these lines, trails when people are moving around, and in some people, they're permanent. They don't go away. So it's really important that teenagers know about this and think about it very carefully. If you have somebody who has some problems with reality testing, maybe schizophrenia, it's especially dangerous for them to use hallucinogenics. Unfortunately, one of the things that you're seeing with teenagers now is you hear about microdosing and using a very small amount. And when people come in and say, hey, I had a really good experience and I feel like I'm in communication with nature and it just made me feel much better from depression. It's hard to argue with that if their experience is positive. I don't know if you guys have heard of ketamine. Ketamine is now legal to be prescribed for cases of treatment-resistant depression. And again, in a monitored setting, which is why, and I have some patients who have tried to do that on their own. Again, it's tough. If you don't have somebody who's having negative effects to just warn them, hey, this is what could happen, this is what could happen. Teenagers are not really as likely to listen. So I think it's really important just, again, to keep this in mind and give them the information. Marijuana is hallucinogenic as well. Marijuana is an interesting drug. Many drugs have multiple effects. It depends on the strain, it depends on the dose. So marijuana can make people less nauseous, which is why they use it for cancer patients. It can make you sleepy, so it helps with sleep. It can lower your anger levels. For some people, it actually can improve their focus as well. People with bipolar disorder are particularly likely to gravitate towards marijuana because it has mood stabilizing qualities. The problem is that, again, it may seem okay and help at the beginning, but later on, especially as you develop more of an addiction to it, then it's not going to work nearly as well, and it's going to be much more difficult to come off of it because now your brain expects it every day. And if you stop using it, those withdrawal symptoms can be pretty severe. People will say, with regard to marijuana as well, you can't really get addicted to marijuana. Well, that's not really true. One of the reasons it's not true is because the dosages that people are using now are far higher than they used to be in the 60s and 70s. It's a very different thing. Especially when you're vaping it, you can have very concentrated levels of THC. Synthetic marijuana, K2 or spice. I haven't seen as much of this lately, but basically people will use something with green leaves like oregano, for example, and they spray what are essentially poisons onto these leaves, and then they smoke it. And they do get, it's more of a hallucinogen because it gives you a sort of an out-of-body experience. The problem, again, is that it can kill you because you don't know what's in it. And the DEA, I think it's the FDA, I'm not sure who monitors these kinds of things, but they do something with the chemical composition that's pretty sneaky. So you will have a chemical that they use to make synthetic marijuana, and then they find it out and the federal government will outlaw that chemical. So then manufacturers go back and they change the chemical just a little bit. So this is a new different thing, and that is not illegal yet. And that's one of the ways they get around these laws. It's really hard to keep up with them. Vaping, and you guys may have some questions about vaping. We can talk about that in a bit. People think that it's safer because it doesn't cause problems. As we all know, there have been a lot of teenagers, not a lot of, but a sizable percentage who have had really bad reactions to vaping, even including, I think there's at least one patient who had to have a double lung transplant. That's how much damage he was doing to his lungs. We're not really sure if that happened, that was due to maybe contamination or if that was due to some of the chemicals that are in the little cartridges where people vape from. And of course, it's a new thing. We really don't know what the long-term effects are. So anytime that's the case, you just don't really know. So I would not consider it a safe thing to do either. Let's see. Let me talk about these here. Is marijuana a gateway drug? It really depends. What we know about marijuana is that most people who use marijuana do not go on to use harder drugs. So we know that. But almost everybody who uses harder drugs started with marijuana. So that's why you have to be careful with that, because again, it can lead to problems down the line, which is why you're concerned. And as parents, if you're thinking, oh, it's just a little bit of weed here and there, I'm not going to be too concerned about it. Again, you need to be concerned about it for the reasons that I mentioned, as well as just the higher concentrations of people using. And that's part of what makes it more addictive. CBD, it's legal in some cases. Cannabidiol, it's being sold almost everywhere, and it's also being advertised as something that's good for everybody, all sorts of different disorders. So whenever you have something that's good for everything, you always have to wonder about that. There are some research that says that it might be helpful, but the research is mixed. CBD oil can have a tiny concentration of marijuana in it, of THC. There's a legal level that they're supposed to adhere to, but because of the lack of standardization in terms of processing, you don't really know. So some people have been using CBD and then they get tested for drugs as part of their job and they test positive. Say, well, I didn't use that, I just used CBD. But there's no regulation of that. So and some of the studies they have done has found that the actual level of THC in these CBD packages varies greatly. So again, to keep that in mind. 90% of addictions start in the teenage years. Keep that in mind. That's, again, you want to delay that till later if you can, or at least to lower their use. Now, interesting here, 27% of teens and 16% of parents think using prescription drugs to get high is safer than using street drugs to get high. Again, that's not entirely true. The one thing about prescription drugs that may be safer is they're standardized. So 20 milligrams of a painkiller, for example, Vicodin, is going to be the same no matter who is, which company is manufacturing it. But what you don't know is if there's things going on in the person who's basically stealing prescription drugs to get high. They may have a medical condition that makes a particular medication very risky. And it also could interact with other medications that they may be taking. So you can't say that it is harmless. All right, let's move on to some tech or behavioral addictions. Again, this is controversial. Not every practitioner believes that these should be called addictions because they're not substances, right? So how can you be addicted to something that isn't a substance? Because how can you get withdrawal symptoms or tolerance? But actually, one of the things that we know is that the same centers of the brain that are activated when you're using drugs are also activated when you're engaging in some of these activities, gaming in particular. So it actually can lead to changes in the way that your brain functions. Take a look at some of these statistics. Do they seem pretty consistent with your perceptions? Obviously, it's not just the teenagers who are addicted to their phones. Many teenagers think their parents are addicted to their phones. So you have to pay attention to whether or not you are maybe setting a not so good example. The other reason why it's helpful to think of these things as addictions is that some of the techniques that we use in substance abuse treatment that help people stop using or cut down on their use or avoid relapse once they stop using, those same techniques can be helpful with behavioral addictions. So that's one of the reasons to do it, to label it that way. Teens spend about 9 hours a day on devices. That seems pretty accurate to me. Half of all teens say that they're addicted to their phones. Yep, that doesn't surprise me either. Parents report the same. So one of the things that as parents, I think is just, it's a real challenge during the pandemic is how much tech time do you allow your teenagers or kids to have? If you leave them, for many kids, if you just leave it up to them to use, they may be using constantly. So, and it is very difficult to sort of set some rules and restrictions, partly because they're so addictive and partly because it's hard to enforce without causing even more problems in the family. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. So these are some signs of smartphone addiction. Feeling a need to constantly respond This causes problems, I hear, with the teenagers and their relationships. If their boyfriend or girlfriend doesn't respond or like something within a certain amount of time, they take it personally. Um, Feeling anxious or depressed when you can't use your phone, ignoring your environment when you're using. I don't know if you've seen teenagers get together. Sometimes they're all sitting on their phones, not even necessarily interacting with each other. When use cause arguments, if your parents take your phone, you'll do anything to get it back. Pretty much every teenager and actually younger child that I know who has a tech device, whether it's an iPad, cell phone, etc., will sneak into their parents' bedroom if they can and take it back when you're not looking. That sounds a lot like sneaking alcohol if you're an alcoholic and it's hidden away somewhere. And you might get upset thinking that they're being disrespectful, they're not following the rules, which is true. But I think you have to keep in mind just how addictive these devices are. So when they're doing that, instead of getting offended by them, taking things without permission, think about this is how addictive this behavior is to this person, that they would do something that maybe normally they wouldn't do. It's a sign that they need some help. Grades dropping, it's a concern here as well. Let me talk a little bit about video game addiction. So about 183 million people in the US play video games. That's a lot of people. Most teens can stick to reasonable limits. If they have the opportunity to go and do other things, they can. But others start preferring the virtual world. So if you're somebody who's very shy, socially anxious, if you're somebody who has autism, doesn't really know how to interact with others, the virtual world where you're defeating the enemy and going on quests, things like that, can be very fun. The problem, of course, is that if you start ignoring the real world, that's a problem as well, because at some point we're all going to be back together and we have to be interacting to be successful. I think about maybe 1 in 10 may be addicted. I've heard 3 in 10. I think it varies. A lot of kids I work with dream of being a YouTuber. I still don't fully understand why you would pay somebody to watch them play a video game. What they tell me is that, again, you learn strategies. And again, some people do make money on this. But I think they said like 98% of the people who are on these and streaming don't make money. I think it's only like 3% make some money. And most of the money is made by an even smaller portion. Now that you want to kind of take the wind out of their sails if you have kids who are really dreaming of doing that. But one of the things I try to tell them is have a backup plan. The video games are designed to be addictive. This is one of the things about clinical psychology I'm not very proud of, is they hire psychologists to do research. So one of the things that they do is they call it the foot in the door technique. So you have this game with maybe, I know adults sometimes play Candy Crush, for example. So you get a certain amount of things with a free app. But then if you want more, if you want specialized weapons, if you want different skins, they use what they call our loot boxes. So then you have to pay to do better in the game. And that's where it really becomes problematic. There are parents who have, they don't know that this is going on until maybe they get a $1,000 bill on their credit card, not realizing that their child has been charging things. And they don't always tell you how much you're paying for it either. Keep in mind, if that ever happens to you, like if you have an iPad and your kids get into it, I believe that they still have a program where they might forgive it the first time. They're not necessarily going to charge you all of that because they recognize it happens, but it's only a one-time thing. All right. Some of the signs, I'll skip over this a little bit. Some signs you might be addicted to video games are very similar to the tech. That you're doing it more and more, you have trouble limiting your use, you're up all night, you know it's causing problems for your family and perhaps your grades and school attendance, but it doesn't seem to be enough to keep you from continuing. Lying about how much time you're spending on a video game. And again, feeling that you'd rather game rather than get involved in friendships. I'm hoping that once the pandemic winds down, that people will be together again physically, and hopefully we'll see some of these tech addictions decline at least a little bit. So here's some risk factors for addiction. So if you have working with a child for whom any of these apply, you need to pay closer attention. So if you have a family member who abuses drugs or alcohol, because that does run in the family, there are some people who can drink alcohol and they just never get addicted. There's other people, as soon as they start drinking, it makes them feel a whole lot better, which fuels the addiction. Having mental health problems, as we talked earlier about self-medication. Having friends who use. So if your child is around a bunch of people and you know they're using, your child may say, no, I'm not using, I just kind of hang out with them. And there might be some truth to that, but it's hard. It's hard to resist that peer pressure. And if everybody else is doing it and having fun and you're the only one not, at some point you're probably going to give in. Doing poorly in school, that's one of the risk factors, decline in grades. And again, if you're doing poorly in school and you're not feeling good about yourself academically, you get involved with a group who's using drugs and all of a sudden you're sort of at an equal level with them. So people gravitate towards those groups because basically people who are using drugs and alcohol are probably more likely to accept you. Having been physically or sexually abused, and that has to do with using drugs or alcohol or gaming as a way of blocking out or dealing with the horrible feelings that you have as a result of that abuse, especially if you've kept it secret and haven't said anything to anybody. The type of drug and how you administer it, that has to do with risk factors. The faster it gets, basically rule of thumb is the faster it gets into your system, the more addictive it is, okay? Antidepressants are not addictive because when you take them, it often takes weeks for it to take an effect. So you're not gonna addict that. But nicotine is very addictive because you smoke on that cigarette and within seconds, your brain starts getting the chemical nicotine and starts relaxing. And also the frequency with which you use nicotine, you know, having a cigarette every 20 minutes. So you're in withdrawal throughout the entire day. That fuels addiction as well. It's one of the reasons that quitting cigarettes is one of the most difficult addictions to overcome. So I'm going to pause after this slide and just ask you if you have any questions. We already did the gateway drug and CBD, but one of the questions I get from parents is, is it okay to share with them my own drug use or alcohol use when I was their age? Because they don't want to appear to condone their use or appear or sound hypocritical. Because, oh, okay, well, mom, dad, you getting high when you were my age. You really don't have a right to say to me that I can't. Again, I think there are advantages and disadvantages. It also depends on how involved your child is. Sometimes it's useful for a child to hear, hey, I got into trouble with my use. I'm trying to prevent you from going down the same path. Teenagers aren't terribly likely to take that because they learn from experience. If they just listened to all the advice we gave them, they would make good decisions all the way along. And again, that's not how it works. You have to make some of these decisions on their own. So again, give some thought to that. If you have a family history of alcoholism and you mention it to your teenager and say, hey, I'm not telling you not to, but I think it's really risky. Here's why. Your risk is higher because of your aunt or uncle so-and-so or grandparents. So again, I do think that can be useful for them to know. Again, keeping in mind when they're making these decisions. So any questions that have come up?
I don't see any in the chat box.
Okay.
So this is the time. If you have any questions, it would be a good time to do that.
Right. Well, let's move on then. We'll get to that other question, Jan, a little bit later when we talk about treatment strategies.
I think that would be one toward the end would be more appropriate. Yeah.
Yes. Agreed.
Thank you.
All right. So negative consequences of addiction. There are quite a few. Keeping in mind, as I said earlier, that the brain, or let me expand on it. Your brain doesn't finish developing fully, they say, till about age 25. So that means that whatever chemical you're putting in your system during your teenage years, your brain develops expecting that drug. Marijuana, let's take that for a second. Marijuana works because it activates receptor sites in the brain. And there are more receptors for THC than there are for many other things. That's why it does so many different things. So if your brain is expecting that and of course normalizes it, if you try to stop later on, your brain doesn't know what to do. All it knows is, hey, something's missing. They're not used to not having it. So your baseline goes from like being here normally without drugs, you start using, maybe you're feeling bad and then you feel better because it makes you a little bit better than normal. And then all of a sudden you don't have that chemical in your system. it may take weeks or months for your brain to recover. The same is true as alcohol. There's something called post-acute withdrawal with alcohol. And if you're a heavy drinker for many years and then you stop, you're going to feel really bad. Because if the alcohol is depressing your brain functioning for all this time, and then all of a sudden you don't have it, your brain goes haywire. You're irritable, you can't sleep, you're frustrated, you can't think, your memory's impaired. And this can take 6 to 18 months to allow your brain to repair itself. And the younger you are, the more likely it is able to do that. When you're older, it is much more difficult, which is why some people end up with some chronic brain trouble as a result of their use. So damage to heart and lungs certainly can happen. Lower grades, it's hard to do well when you're busy getting high or engaging in gaming. Overdose, as I said before, you don't know how much you're getting in these substances. That's one of the ways in which teenagers die. They don't know what they're putting into their systems. And again, with injection, if you're an IV drug user, it gets into your system so quickly, it's very difficult. Legal problems, getting in trouble with the law. That's something that could affect you, moving forward. Job loss. Some jobs will drug test you. Brain damage, I've already talked about. I sometimes will show this graph to teenagers to get them to think about it. Let me explain this real briefly. Daniel Amen, he does these the infomercials, if you will, on online. Netflix, I think, has them. But anyway, he does these scans of the brain, and he looks at the amount of blood flow to different areas of the brain. So if you see up here where it's healthy underside, healthy top down, when it's all filled in like that, that means there's blood flow going to all sorts of parts of the brain. So as you add drugs, for example, 4 years of marijuana use, age 17, those holes don't mean they're actual holes in the brain. What it means is there's parts of the brain that are less active as a result. And so if they're less active, that's why it may be difficult to learn, to retain what you learn, to make good decisions. The front lobes of your brain are the parts that help you make decisions. It's the higher level thinking. So if the drug you're taking lowers the activity, you're going to have a harder time. Look at cocaine use, 4 years of cocaine use. Yeah, it definitely affects your brain. And I show this, there's some controversy to this. Not everybody thinks that the science is advanced enough to really make much of this, but I do think there's something to it, because we do see the brain not functioning as well with extended use. All right. Having in your bedroom increases your risk. I don't know how many of you allow your kids to have tech in their rooms. The teenagers are probably more likely to have it, whether it's a gaming system, a TV, a laptop, or whatever. They're definite risks. If you have it all in your room, there's less of a need to come out of your room. You're not going to be able to monitor it as well. And certainly it increases your risk of addiction. Now, on the flip side, if you have a teenager who's pretty responsible with these things, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to allow it. Your determining factor should be the level of impairment that you see. And that's true in tech addiction in general. Just something I want to say, that if your teenagers seem to be managing okay, they're getting their chores done, they're getting their homework done, and they're spending a lot more time on gaming or social media, whatever, I don't worry too much about that. I have some kids who have been willing to, in exchange for having more flexibility in how they choose to spend their time, as long as they spend some time with a family, playing a family game, watching a movie together, making sure everybody has dinner together. So as long as they're able to balance that, again, I don't worry as much. It's more of a concern when your child never shows up and wants to eat in their room. And I have a number of families where that's what goes on. They take their food, they go into the room, and everybody's in their own corners. And that's not, obviously that's not so healthy. Teen addiction, some warning signs. Again, if you see some of these things, problems with school, getting into trouble, falling asleep in class, you're going to get more of that with online school, just because it's really hard to stay focused. Personality changes, loss of interest in hobbies, and that's actually a pretty good indicator. If you have somebody who is really big into sports and they're having a good time, and then all of a sudden they just seem to not be so interested, and if there's a change of their friends, choosing a different friend group, those can be some warning signs. So that's why it's important to pay close attention to their behaviors. Okay, moving along. So one of the ways in which we diagnose addictive disorders, and Let me back up a little bit. We used to call them alcohol abuse disorder or alcohol dependence disorder. That abuse was about using it but not being addicted. Dependence was mean that you were actually dependent on the substance. That's been eliminated in the latest version of the DSM-5. So now we call it all use disorders. It seems a little bit less pejorative. I think that was one of the reasons for making that change. So it's a use disorder that the use of this substance is causing problems. So again, continuing to use after it causes problems is one of the things we look at. Loss of control over your use. If you're trying to set limits for yourself and you cannot stick to those limits, that's a sign. Problems with family and friends as a result, if it's causing conflict. Using when risky or dangerous, okay? Texting while driving would be a good example of that. If you are so addicted to your phone that as soon as you get a notification, you have to look at it, that can greatly increase your risk of an accident. We know people who are texting and driving are as impaired in their attention as they would be if they were drunk. Signs of tolerance or withdrawal. Again, tolerance is when you need more of the substance or activity to achieve the same effect. Withdrawal is when you stop using it, you feel bad. You stop gaming, for example, and all of a sudden you're anxious and depressed and nervous and you can't sleep. That's an indication that you are more addicted than you might realize. Using larger amounts or longer time than you planned. So one of the things you can do in terms of treatment even is setting some limits for yourself. For example, gaming. If your child is gaming, 10 hours a day and it's causing problems, you say, okay, well, tell you what, why don't we come up with a plan here? Okay, you're going to use for this number of hours and then stop. And if they can do that, great. If they can't do that despite trying, that's an indication that it's a problem. Because again, some people can lower their use. Other people, when they try, it never works. Spending a lot of time getting or using the substance or recovering from its effects. That's another level of impairment. And obviously, if you're spending a lot of time with this substance or activity, you don't have time to focus on other responsibilities. Strong cravings to keep using. That's when you stop using and again, you're just miserable and you just want to use. It's all you want to do. And failing to meet your responsibilities. All right. Continued use, knowing that you have a physical or psychological problem caused by its use, or continued use knowing that you have social problems that are caused or made worse by it. One of the things that we see with teenagers is cyberbullying. So sometimes what happens is that people go on, and especially the kids with autism or other disabilities and that along those lines, they don't really have the judgment to know if what they are posting or commenting on is appropriate. So they get bullied because they get tricked into responding to things. Or if you look at social or group text or even just social media, and you find out that everybody else was invited to something and you were not. So that can obviously cause problems and make your depression worse if you're feeling excluded. It's almost like it's much more public now to realize that you've not been included. We've already talked about tolerance and withdrawal. All right, let me go into some treatment options here. There's a number of treatment options available. So self-help groups are the easiest thing to access. Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. There are groups that are more popular with teenagers. Usually if you ask around, if you contact one of the local treatment centers, hospitals, they often know some of those groups. This way you're talking to other people who get it. I think for a lot of people with addiction, there's nothing like being able to talk to somebody else who knows what it's like. Because if you're trying to explain that to somebody who has no idea, chances are they may not get it. And they think that you're overreacting or that it's just, that it's more under your control than you think. Individual or family therapy. Family therapy can be very helpful because addiction is a family disease. Everybody gets affected by it. Individual therapy can be helpful as well because sometimes teenagers with addictions they're not honest with you about how bad the problem is. So I'll want to spend some time individually to see what's going on. Group therapy, for the reasons I said earlier, same things with the AA and NA. Some of the hospital treatment centers do run groups as well. There are some outpatient ones as well. Group therapy, again, being around your peers. One of the hardest things for teenagers actually all ages, but focus on teenagers here, is having to give up your friendship group. If all of them are using and you've decided, or your parents have decided that it has to stop and you're trying to set limits, you're going to be pretty lonely because your whole support system just evaporated. So something like group therapy can help you develop other friendships with people who are supportive and can work with you in terms of recovery. Intensive outpatient therapy, that's when you go a few times a week. And that's also group, and maybe like 3 to 5, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I don't know if they're running now with COVID. I'm sure that some of them are online at this point. Day treatment or partial hospitalization, that's when you go all day. You're not hospitalized overnight, but you get most of the same treatment that you would get if you were an inpatient. Because usually with hospitalization, there has to be a more severe disorder. If you are addicted to an opiate or alcohol, and it may be dangerous for you to just stop on your own. Sometimes you go into hospitalization so they can give you medication that makes it easier to detox from it. Residential treatment is the most intensive treatment here. That's when you go for not just a couple of weeks as you might with hospitalization, but it could be 3 to 6 months. And residential treatment can be helpful for some people if it takes them out of their environment, and that way it can be monitored much more closely. And again, usually that happens after hospitalization has failed. If you're repeatedly hospitalized and every time you go back home, you relapse, that may be an indication that residential treatment is needed. Because one of the problems with
Chris,
hospitalization even is that if you are addicted to something and you're in the hospital, you're going to feel pretty miserable when you're stopping your use. It could take a couple of weeks before your brain is even able to absorb what you're trying to learn, from the treatment interventions there.
okay, Dr. Chris, we have a question. Are
Awesome.
there
Go
any
ahead.
groups specifically for gaming addictions?
There are, yes. Actually, and that's one of the resources I provide here. There's a website, actually, there's something called Rise Gaming Recovery in California. They actually have inpatient settings for gaming addiction. Something called Restart in Washington State treats internet and gaming addictions. GameQuitters.com offers an at-home program for purchase to help people with gaming addiction. So they are out there. If you just even do an internet search under video game addiction recovery, you will find places across the country. I think it's becoming a more common thing. Actually, in China, they have, I think, what did they say? They have like 300 million people who have problems with gaming. I mean, it's a huge thing, and they have treatment centers. I think South Korea also has a pretty high level of gaming. So yeah, they are out there, and that's difficult with, in general, with tech addictions. To give up all your tech devices is not really practical. If they're not away with you, if they're outside the home, you want to be able to get in touch with them. You also want them to be able to connect with friends. And speaking of that, that's one of the things that you have to be careful of in terms of tech addictions and phones. If you have somebody who's suicidal, teenagers have told me that one of the things that saved them is being able to contact a friend in the middle of the night for support. So you don't want them up all night on their phones, but I do think that you have to talk with them to see what's going on. And if that's something that keeps them safe, you need to think twice about taking their phones. There are apps you can get that will help limit their use. They're not foolproof. It's not like you can prevent them and 100% prevent them from doing anything, but you make it more difficult. And I think that's kind of your role in terms of addictions as well, even with substances. You cannot stop them from ever using again. You do not have that level of control, but you can make it harder for them. For example, if you have somebody that, if one of your teenagers is using drugs, you can say, if you're choosing to use drugs, you lose the privilege of having your room be a private place. So that means we are going to inspect your room, periodically and do a search. What some parents have done is they do that for a while, kid does better, and they say, okay, I'm not going to, sorry about that. You might say to them, okay, you're doing better, so we'll give you a little bit more freedom here. Let's see how that goes. And if it doesn't work, then you maybe go back to that and say, okay, now we have to try something a little bit different. So it's important to have that dialogue. A lot of parents make sure that their computers, laptops, whatever, are like in the living room or a common area. Certainly with the younger kids, it's a really good idea to have it in a common area that allows you to monitor it more carefully. But again, by making things harder to do, at least you're cutting down on their use, hopefully, and that has value. So don't think you're not doing anything. All right. So relapse is going to occur. And I think it's important to know that going in. It doesn't mean that they failed. It doesn't mean that you as parents have failed. It means this is a very difficult substance or behavior to overcome. So the important thing in terms of relapse is, what do they learn from it? If they go out to a party and they end up relapsing, say, okay, well, we learned that we really can't go to parties right now. It's just too tempting, for example. Relapse or a recurrence of symptoms. I thought it was important to just mention this. And this relates to the first thing as well, that if you have cancer and it gets treated successfully, and then your cancer comes back, do you say that you've relapsed? Or do you say the symptoms have recurred? Because relapse sounds again, it sounds like a negative thing, and it sounds like you failed. You relapsed, so you failed. So I think it's important, in the substance abuse community, some people are not using that word relapse. They just focus on recurrence of symptoms. It means the symptoms came back. It's not necessarily something you did wrong. It just happens. Also, some people will differentiate between a slip or a lapse or a relapse. That with the Alcoholics Anonymous program, you might have a month sober, 3 months sober, 6 months sober, right? And you celebrate those milestones. So say you're 90 days sober, and then you go out and you drink on the 91st day. Okay, now you're back to square one. Some people feel like it's very demoralizing for some people, because it feels like, okay, all that time I was doing well, now I've ruined it. Now, if they can do maybe slip or lapse is something that's briefer in duration. So say you mess up, you have a couple of drinks, you're not feeling good about it, maybe nothing bad happened, but you go right back the next day to being sober. Someone saying it was just a slip or a lapse makes them feel not so bad, because it's not like you lost that whole period. You should feel good about the long period that you did have where you weren't using. Monitoring pro-addiction versus pro-recovery thoughts. What we mean by that is that cognitive behavioral therapy is all about changing your thinking process. So if you can help teenagers sort of monitor their thinking. So the pro-addiction thoughts are often not very accurate. Pro-addiction thoughts are things like, I'll just use one time, it's not going to be that bad. Or what's the harm in, I've been a month sober, why not do this? Those are pro-addiction thoughts versus pro-recovery thoughts, which would be, okay, well, if you end up using, your parents are probably going to find out, then you're going to get grounded again, then they're going to take your phone, and all these bad things that are going to happen as a result. So those pro-recovery thoughts can help you stay on the right path. And it's really important to monitor that kind of thinking. One of the strategies that I that I use a lot with teenagers is to finish, and young adults, finish the thought. So if you're starting to have a pro-addiction thought that says it's not going to be a big deal, or maybe this time I can control it. It's like, okay, finish that thought based on your past experience. Okay, yes, you got high a couple times with your friends. It was no problem. And then you start doing a little bit more. All right. And then your parents find out, and then they ground you. And then they're not going to let me use the car anymore because I've been getting high. So now I can't go out with my friends. And I'm on probation. And if I get tested positive on probation, then I get put in detention. If you finish the thought, by the time you get to the end result, the desire to use may be diminished. And that's one of the goals of that. And I find that's very useful. There's something also called euphoric recall, that after a while of not using a substance, you start thinking about the good times that you had, and you conveniently forget the bad times. So it's important to kind of monitor those things. Helping teens find healthy substitutes, that's a key thing in recovery. That boredom is one of the things that triggers use. So if you can find healthy substitutes, ways in which they can enjoy themselves without the negative consequences associated with it, that is important. Having a hobby, kids who play music, piano, guitar, whatever, doing some volunteer work, joining a club at school when that's allowed, hopefully this fall, a game night with friends. If they can engage in healthy substitutes for their behaviors, they're more likely to succeed and avoid relapse. If they don't have that, the chances of relapse are much higher. Helping teens learn to manage their emotions. One of the things I tell parents all the time is that your teenagers are still learning how to manage their emotions. Yeah, they're going to be disrespectful. They're going to raise their voice at you, things like that. That's normal. They're still learning. So try not to take it quite so personally. So if you see yourself as a parent, you're the educator. Your child is your student. You're not going to yell at them because they get a math problem wrong. You're going to go to them, explain why they I got it wrong, and what they need to do differently. And if you take that attitude, you're going to be much more successful with your teenagers. So if you help them learn to manage their emotions, they're less likely to need to resort to substances to feel better. Maintain therapy and medication if needed. A lot of times people start feeling better and say, I don't need therapy anymore. If they're on medication for a disorder and you say, well, I don't need to do this anymore, people can relapse. Especially, for example, if you are treating somebody for depression, they're on medicine that helps. And then they get involved, then they stop taking the medicine because they feel better, they get more depressed, increases their risk for relapse. So it's really important to keep that going. Let me talk a little bit about the role of drug testing. You can get relatively inexpensive drug tests at the CVS, drugstores, etc. Sometimes that can be very useful. So I know it may be an invasion of privacy to ask your child to pee into a cup or whatnot, but it is one of the ways of making it harder for them to use. It also gives teenagers an out. So if they're out with their friends and they're tempted to drink or use drugs or whatever, you can say, well, hey, I'd love to, but my parents are testing me and they know I'm going to this party. If I go home and I test positive, I'm not going to be able to go out again for 2 weeks or a month or whatever. So it gives them an out, so it makes it easier to save face with friends. So I think drug testing can be very helpful. One of my first jobs when I moved to DC in the 80s was at a methadone clinic. And every week you had a drug test. What we'd actually do, if you have somebody who you think is using and you're not testing, you're not catching them, is you do a drug test on Monday, and then a day or two later you do another drug test, because people will try to figure, okay, if I'm only getting tested once a week, the day after I test, I can use for a little bit, and it'll be out of my system by the next time. So if you're concerned that you may not be catching them, and it's not just about catching them. It's about sort of monitoring and giving them feedback. Okay, this is harder for you to stop than you thought. Having a code or a safe word. This is a really important thing if you have teenagers. So if your teenager is out with friends, okay, and those friends may be using, and your child may not be comfortable on their own just saying, hey, I can't use, I need to leave. Having a code or safe word can be helpful. For example, if you text them and you say, hey, how is it going? And they text you back and the code word is, Apple, you would know that they're in trouble and they need a ride home. So then what you can do is text or call your teenager and say, hey, Aunt so-and-so's in the hospital, we really need you to come right home. And that, again, gives them an out. It saves them from a risky situation. All right. So let me talk about the importance of parental involvement. As I mentioned earlier, addiction is a family disease. Everybody gets affected one way or another. If you have somebody with an addiction, a lot of emotional energy is probably going into dealing with that person. So it's important to keep those people as part of the treatment as well. Addictive behaviors damage relationships, and that's a very important thing as well. And so when relationships are damaged, it's much harder to mend them, because if you're going to be engaging in addictive behavior, there's going to be distrust, there's going to be lying, there's going to be sneaking around. And that's one of the things to work with teenagers on, the importance of trying to be more honest. Keep in mind, one of the other, I think, challenges for parents is you want your child to be honest with you, right? So if they're honest and they tell you that they got high at a party Saturday night, and your response is, oh, thanks for telling me, thanks for being honest, you can't go to parties anymore, right? You're punishing them for being honest. At the same time, you don't want to just let that be. So this is why it's really important to strengthen your relationship with your teenager with healthy communication, to try to be as open, respectful, non-judgmental, and listening without overreacting. So if this were to happen to your teenager and he or she comes home and lets you know that, to say, hey, I'm a little disappointed that you slipped, but I'm really glad that you felt comfortable enough telling me. How do you feel about what happened? I'm uncomfortable having you go to other parties as this is going on. What can we do to make sure that you're safe at a party and that I don't have to be up all night worrying about you? And maybe you come up with some ideas. Maybe they text you periodically to let you know that it's okay. You come up with, again, code word or safe word. Maybe you limit the times that they can go out to parties with friends. And again, it's hard. I can't say that there's a right or wrong answer with this. It really depends on the person and the situation. I can't emphasize enough though. If you punish them for being open and honest with you, you're not going to get more honesty. This is easier said than done. I get that. So one of the things we do in treatment is use what's called motivational interviewing technique. So what that involves is not lecturing the patients, not telling them why drug and alcohol use or tech addiction is so bad. We want them to sort of think about it. And so motivational interviewing is a way of helping build motivation in person to change. So if you find out that your teenager is using drugs, say, hey, why did you start using? You know, how did you make that decision? You know, what are some of the good things about your addiction? What are some not so good things? What makes you think you might need to make a change? What might happen if you choose to change? What might happen if you choose not to change? And there, as parents, that's where you're setting some limits as well to say, hey, if you choose not to change and you continue to use, you know, I'm going to also take action to make it harder for you to use. And I don't really want that kind of relationship with you. What can we come up with that might help both of us? So it may be that you come up with a deal, again, maybe they have to come home early, maybe you do a drug test, a breathalyzer test even when they come home. Maybe it's something along the lines of, how would I say? There's another example I wanted to mention here. If you have a child who is overnight with friends and you find out that they were supposed to drive back, but they're too impaired to drive, again, do you punish them or do you thank them for saying, hey, thanks for letting me know. Definitely spend the night. We'll talk about this tomorrow. Because safety has to come first. And that's something where, again, I can't emphasize enough. Let them know that if for any reason they're impaired and they call you to come pick them up, you will not yell or scream at them. You will thank them. You'll talk about it later. But you don't want to make it harder because the last thing you want to have happen is that your punishment is so severe that they try to drive home drunk and they get into an accident. So encouraging positive behavior, focusing on the good. It's very easy when you have addiction going on to focus on the bad behavior. Human nature is such that you're more likely to notice bad behavior than good behavior. When good behavior is going on, you figure, oh, that's how it's supposed to be. So it's really important. And teenagers with addictions don't feel so good about themselves. So one of the ways you build self-esteem is to encourage the positive behavior, let them know that you're happy with them, that what things that they do well, catch them being good. Participating in therapy. There are some therapists who only work with teenagers and they really don't work with the parents. That doesn't work. I don't think it works in general personally, but it definitely doesn't work in substance abuse treatment or addiction treatment in general. So you should be part of the therapy. One of the things I do with teenagers is I almost always bring parents in for part of a session, and we may share with the parents kind of what we were working on. You may want to have, that doesn't work for everybody. Sometimes there's so much volatility and negativity that just ends up being a free-for-all brawl, and that's not useful. So in that case, don't hesitate to ask the therapist, hey, can I have some time with you? Can I have a session with you? I'm not sure how to handle this. So one of your goals as a therapist is to help parents figure out how to do things like set limits, how to be firm and not be angry, helping them come up with a different strategy. Obviously, lectures and yelling don't help. What is necessary when parents are involved with addiction is you're going to have to tighten up your parenting a little bit more, right? But sometimes one analogy that's been shared with me that I think makes some sense. It's almost like you give them a little bit more rope so they're going out and doing their own thing on their own. If they mess up, you pull the rope back in a little bit. You provide a little bit more structure, a few more limits. Not permanently, but it's a way that allows you to monitor things more closely. And as they do better, then you give them a little bit more freedom again. That's part of, I think, what parenting teenagers are about, because at the end of their teenage years, you want them to function more independently. And if you over control them their entire teenage period, they're not going to know how to make good decisions as adults. They're going to go wild. It's one of the things we can see when kids go away to college. If they don't get a chance to try things and make mistakes while they're in high school, they're not going to be prepared for the challenges and temptations of college. Establishing guidelines, clear and consistent rules. You have to decide what extent you will tolerate their behavior. Okay, involving teens in this process is important. If you collaborate with them on a system or some guidelines or some rules about substance use or gaming or whatnot, they're more likely to follow through. So you have to think about what will you and will you not tolerate. For example, is it okay with you if your child gets high on the weekends with friends? Most parents would not say, oh yeah, no problem at all. And it's never a wise choice. But is that would you panic if that were happening? Would you allow drinking? Is that okay? They're 17 years old and they're at a party. Keep in mind also, if you're there at your house and you allow drinking and something happens, you're legally liable. Another thing that I have parents remind their children of is that by age 16, 15, most teenagers are wanting to drive. If you allow your teenager to drive, knowing they're under the influence, knowing they're using marijuana every day, and your teenager gets into an accident and hurts somebody else or kills them, you could be held liable as well. So you have to think about that also. But the good news about that, though, it does give you a rationale for being more restrictive. Instead of saying, oh, you're not going to drive anymore, you're done with that, I'm not giving your license back and whatever. You say, hey, I can't let you drive under these circumstances. You're choosing to use marijuana daily, and yeah, it's not fair to the rest of us. If I lose our house, I lose my job because of what you're doing, because we get sued. That's not fair to everybody else. So I'd be breaking the law if I let you do this. So I'm going to pull back. But once you test negative and you've been able to be clean for a period of time, absolutely, we can reconsider driving. So that way they have an incentive to improve. Are you willing to sacrifice your own needs? How much running around are you going to do? How much oversight are you going to do of your teenager to try to deal with things? You do have to keep your own needs in mind and the needs of the rest of the family. Will you pay for their attorney fees if they get arrested? Will you bail them out of jail? Now, under COVID, of course, I don't think as many kids are being detained unless they're a real danger to society. But these are some things to think about. I have teenagers who, because they got arrested for DWI or whatever it might be related to substances, they borrow the money from their parents for an attorney and they get a job and they have to pay back that money. That's a lot of money. Are you willing to involve the legal system? So, if you feel like your child is using drugs or alcohol to the extent that their life is at risk, and the only way that you can take them away from that setting is to have them arrested and put on probation, that may be something that's worth doing. Once that happens, you don't have control over the outcome. So I don't ever recommend that as a first line of intervention, but keep that in your back pocket because at some point it may be necessary, as hard as that would be. Importance of self-care. Obviously making your needs a priority as well as the rest of the family. Make sure you participate in your teen's therapy, as I mentioned. Make time for exercise. Probably most of us have put on a little bit of weight during the pandemic, but exercise is one of the best ways to relieve stress. There's a group called Families Anonymous, and that group is a self-help group, but it's for family members and parents of kids who are addicted. And again, for you guys, it's also important to talk to other people who've been through this. You also learn what other people have tried, what's worked for them, what's haven't worked. This is really difficult stuff. So having that support is helpful. Reducing stress in other parts of your life. If you're dealing with someone with a drug addiction, for example, that can be overwhelming. If you're having to take them to treatment, say they're an intensive outpatient, they're going to groups, whatever it might be, it's okay to let some other things go because so what do they say on airlines, right? Put on your own mask before you help your child. That's true of parenting, I think, as well. You have to take care of yourself if you're going to be at your best for helping your child. Relaxation or mindfulness skills. There's a lot of information out there. There's apps you can get. Letting go of blame. Let me mention that real quick. I think it's natural for parents to blame themselves, thinking that you did something wrong because your child is addicted to gaming or using substances, etc. If only I talked to them more, if only I'd been a stricter parent, I just didn't spend enough time with them. So there's nothing you can do about that. And it is not your fault. You didn't make them use substances. Are there things you might have done as parents that made it worse? That's possible. But the best way to do that is simply acknowledge it. You know, if you feel like you did something or you overreacted, it's okay to apologize. Say, hey, listen, I really regret that. I was upset with your behavior, but I shouldn't have said that about you, or shouldn't have yelled at you, or made you feel worse about yourself. But if you let go of blame, because the thing is, if you blame yourself, it's going to be harder to set those firm limits. So some conclusions here. Addiction is a serious problem. Most people will relapse, and not everybody gets better. Parenting is going to be intensely difficult. This is not easy stuff. Be prepared the treatment may be for the long term. It's not unusual for people to do well for a while, and then maybe they relapse 6 months, a year, 2 years, and they need to go back for some treatment for a bit. That's just part of the process. So be prepared for that. It doesn't mean that everything has failed. It may mean that whatever recovery plan was going on just wasn't adequate enough to handle your teenage problems. Balancing your teen's needs with the needs of the rest of your family. I've had kids who are families where the child who had the substance abuse problem goes to live with another relative for a while because it was having such a negative effect on the other kids in the family. It is okay to focus on them as well. It's not fair to them to be neglected or left behind. And there is hope. People do get better. We do have strategies that help. So I know it's a lot of stuff I threw at you. What questions do you guys have?
So far, no one is entering any, or you can
You wanna read
always
that
unmute yourself.
question off then?
Dr. Crest?
Yes,
Hey, it's Kristen. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. So would these same strategies be used for somebody who had like an addiction to food?
These same strategies can help. What makes activity addictions like that harder is obviously everybody needs food. If you lock, I mean, there's some medications that make you very hungry, the antipsychotics, for example. And I've had parents who've locked the refrigerator, they lock snacks in their bedrooms. You know, it's sad to have to do that. And ultimately that only goes so far. But I think with something like food, it has to be sort of ongoing. It involves teaching healthy nutrition habits. It's not having high calorie things in the house that are temptations. If you had an alcoholic in the house, you're not going to keep booze around because it's just too tempting. So food can be the same way. And also keeping in mind that it's going to be harder to be successful when you're limiting food. Again, not everybody feels like food is an addiction, but clearly if you look at some, there's groups like Overeaters Anonymous. And actually, at the end of the last chapter of my book, What's the Big Deal About Addictions, all the different support groups for all sorts of addictive behaviors are out there, and they have something for everybody. I mean, even self-injury, love addiction, pornography addiction, sex addiction, gambling, they all have their support groups. So again, it is difficult. It can get better, but also since food is such a control issue, there's a couple things that kids can control on their own without you have very little control over what they put in their mouth and what comes out. And so that's why when you have issues with toileting early on, often that's a control issue because they know how badly you want them to do it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but these techniques can all be useful. It's a matter of applying it to a particular situation.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for showing up.
Hello, I have a question. Did you say something earlier about the DSM-4 and the use of the words abuse or addiction and not using one or the other?
Yes.
Okay, could you explain that a little bit more?
So again, some disorders get relabeled as time goes on, as we learn more about the causes of these behaviors or disorders. So we used to call like alcoholism or an alcoholic, that's not a clinical term that we use as clinicians because we go by the diagnostic manual. I mean, we still sometimes will use it because I think it does explain things, but if you're calling someone an alcoholic, it's like, that's all they are. They're just an alcoholic. You're just a druggie or a drug addict. You don't want to reduce somebody just to that one thing. So the disorders with addictions are now labeled use disorders, not abuse or dependence. So substance use disorder, that'd be alcohol use disorder, cannabis use disorder, opioid use disorder, and they meet certain criteria. So that's just the new terminology that we use.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any others? Dr. Chris, would you like to address that question I had emailed to you from a parent?
Yes, I can go ahead and read it.
Okay.
So my son is adopted from Russia and has fetal alcohol syndrome. He has many addictive behaviors and we have been unsuccessful in having anything work other than the removal of the items. We have sweets locked up. He has no access to electronics without monitoring due to a porn problem. He's on board with improving these areas, but just doesn't seem to make anything stick. Now he's 19. If he slips up in these areas, he heads towards depression and suicidal thinking. He's on the CCC Plus waiver and SSI. He works part-time, goes to Nova with assistance. He has a therapist, is on medication for anxiety, depression, ADHD symptoms. What more can be done to be successful in breaking these addictions? So that's a very good question. It sounds like in this case, the family's doing everything right. He's getting treatment for disorders, anxiety, depression, ADHD. They're in therapy. They're using some limits here. Because some kids, especially those with fetal alcohol issues, are going to have harder time with self-regulation. Remember that self-regulation, that's a higher level brain function, the frontal lobes of the brain. When you have fetal alcohol syndrome, it really limits your ability to do that. So some of these restrictions may need to go on indefinitely. The fact that he's home does give you some more ability to monitor. There are apps you can get for internet routers, for computers, so that it helps you monitor what they're doing. And if you have something where every site that they visit shows up on your screen, that again can help you monitor. And this is actually, let me talk about real quick, pornography addiction. Again, some people don't see it that way, but it fits all the criteria that we've been talking about. If you have a teenage boy, they've accessed porn at some point. I think about 95 to 98% of studies say. So it's going to happen. It's just a matter of how you address it. And that's also something with the level of the amount at which they're doing it. If they're 10, 20 minutes a day when they're bored and it's not causing problems, I wouldn't worry as much about that. One of the things that I will tell teenagers is that I don't want you to get the impression that this is how real relationships work, okay? These are people paid to do something that might be a fantasy or whatnot. But if you're involved with that, it's going to make it much harder for you to actually be in a relationship because you're not going to know how to interact with somebody, how to get to know somebody, all the things that go into a healthy relationship. So in cases like this, I will talk with them to try to help them limit their use, but I wouldn't panic. On the other hand, with pornography, I mean, in sexting, we didn't really talk about that. But if you have teenagers sexting each other, sending inappropriate pictures, you know, the teenager sending it can be labeled a sex offender, right? The person who is obtaining those pictures is now is in possession of child pornography, even if both people are 16 or 17 years old. That's how the law works in most states. So we do want to put some limits on those. For some people, I mean, they may watch porn for hours and they don't come out of their rooms and it's causing all sorts of difficulties. And there you have to be more restrictive. And somebody with limitations like this teenager does, you're going to have to keep those restrictions in place because they're not going to be able to regulate that. I mean, the sad thing for kids like that is that he probably, I don't know, but he feel like he doesn't have the ability to actually have real life relationships. And so this becomes a substitute. And on the one hand, nobody's getting hurt on it. The other hand, there's some really bad things about it as well. So I think they're doing all the right things. And like I said about relapse, you have to be careful. Relapse is going to happen. It doesn't mean getting angry or upset or disappointed or hurt is kind of beside the point. It doesn't really help. It's better to have an attitude of sort of curiosity. Hey, I see that you went back to this. What happened? How did this occur? You know, what were you thinking? How were you feeling? How do you feel about it afterwards? You know, are you willing to work with me on helping you overcome this addiction? Those approaches, those collaborative problem-solving approaches are much more likely to be successful than just to say, hey, you messed up again. I'm restricting you for the next 2 weeks. That doesn't really teach them much. Punishment's the least effective form of discipline, but that's a whole other talk. Other questions?
Yes, I have a question about the CBD.
Yeah.
I am concerned about the widespread availability of that substance in everyday things that we use, lotions, shampoos, you name it. And I've been very conscious to look more closely at labels to make
Mhm.
sure that it doesn't contain that. But since there's very little regulation, are they required to list if it's in the substances that we use every day?
I there's very little regulation of it, so it's kind of a Wild West free for all. So you don't know what's in it. They're actually, as I mentioned earlier, that they say that they're only limited to a certain percentage of THC, but it goes higher. And one of the theories behind CBD is actually two. One is there's a placebo effect. If you take something, even a psychiatric medication, you take it, a certain amount of people are going to think that they felt better, even if they got a placebo, not the real thing, because that's how strong your expectations are in your brain for actually creating a particular reaction to something. But also, the people who are reporting benefit from CBD, it's possible it's coming from the little bit of THC that's in there. So that's one of the other things that they're looking at. So yeah, I do think you have to be careful. I mean, a topical cream, something like that, probably not going to do much damage. Something you're ingesting obviously has a greater likelihood. It's probably not as dangerous. Certainly, I think it's probably less dangerous than getting high every day as a way of controlling pain. But you got to keep a close eye on it. And sometimes if you see the product, look it up. They may have done a study because they don't study all of them, but some of them have been. Some of the consumer groups have tested various things, and they're the ones that said, what they say is in the product isn't necessarily true.
Okay.
Fluctuations. So again, to be careful. That's what I would say. Be cautious about that.
Okay.
Other questions? Let me scroll down just a little bit more here. These are some resources. Okay. See the second one, parentology, ways to help a teen addicted to video games, talking about one of the questions earlier, social media addiction, Families Anonymous. I don't know if you guys have heard of the book Chasing the High. It's a good book to try to explain to parents what that's all about. Beautiful Boy. Does everybody know if that's a movie? It's based on a book by David Sheff. It's a who is it? Timothy Chalamet is in that movie now. It's actually I think it's worth watching. It gives you sort of an idea. But David Sheff is a journalist, and he wrote a book, Beautiful Boy, about his son who got involved with methamphetamine and other drugs, and trying to save him from himself, and just the havoc it wreaked on the family. And then his son, Nick, who was the abuser, wrote his own books. Tweak was his perspective of what was going on at the same time. And again, I think those books are useful because, again, it gives you a sense of how they think and what they feel, how this develops. And when you understand something better, I think it's easier to come up to address it in a healthier way. Our website, cfcc.info, has a number of sites. We have a whole page for support groups for various disorders. And we have a parenting page and a page on addiction. So a lot of resources there. You can learn more about my practice and some of the other books I've written, jamesjchrist.com. I do have some podcasts based on previous talks that you can access there. And if you wanted to order any of my books from Free Spirit, you use the discount code CHRIST, you will get that discount. So, and here's some of my contact information. I don't know if you saw that in the chat box, there should have been a handout link for did it show up or no, Jen?
It didn't,
Okay.
but you already emailed me that handout, correct?
I did. So they can either do that, or if they want to email me directly, I can send it to them as well, whatever's easier for people.
And then I will be sending out the link, any handouts, the link to the slides and a link to the recording, either later today or depending on what else happens here, or early next week. I'm off on Monday, so, Tuesday at the earliest. But thank you so much, Dr. Christ.
You're very welcome.
And I'm sure we'll be in touch again for future presentations.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Well,
I think it went well.
I know there's a lot of information to throw out there, but I suspect,
It was, that's why it helps to record it, which reminds me I need to stop the recording.
yes.